Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? I am extremely excited to introduce Harper Seldin, who is a senior staff attorney in the LGBTQ and HIV project at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. He is litigating multiple cases challenging state bans on medical care for transgender adolescents and attempts to restrict access to care at the federal level, including PFLAG versus Trump. I hope I pronounced that right. He has authored amicus briefs on the rights of transgender students in schools, and in 2021, he was named one of the best LGBT lawyers under 40 by the LGBT Bar Association. Prior to joining the ACLU, he was a partner at a large national law firm specializing in complex commercial disputes and representing large technology clients in state and federal court, both at trial and on appeal. Harper graduated magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and clerked for a federal district court judge in Pennsylvania. So welcome, 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 Harper. And interviewing him is going to be Joseph Darius Jaafari, who is the editor-in-chief of Lookout. Those of you who have been connected with CEBV have seen Joseph on our Zoom several times. But Lookout is one of the nation's only nonprofit news outlets focused on accountability journalism for the LGBTQ plus community. He received his undergraduate degree in film from York College in Queens, New York, as well as a graduate degree in urban reporting and documentary filmmaking from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Joseph is originally from Mesa, Arizona, and he has worked as an investigative reporter for the Marshall Project, PA Post, Spotlight, Pennsylvania, I assume that's Pennsylvania, and the Arizona Republic, covering prisons, jails, and police. His work on that has earned him recognition from the Keystone Awards, Best of the West, and he was a finalist for both the Silver Gavel Award and the Al Newharth Award for Innovation in Investigative Journalism. He's also been published in The Atlantic, Vice News, and the New York Times on issues such as military safety, HIV discrimination, and sexual assault in rural Africa. So that should all knock your socks off, everyone. So we are extremely excited to bring you to a conversation between Joseph and Harper. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I super appreciate you reading the entire bio that I
Yeah.
sent you. So thank you all so much for attending online tonight. I'm very excited to be moderating this very important discussion with the hope that you can all walk away a little bit more engaged, empowered, and probably with a more solid understanding of what's at stake for the LGBTQ community, not just here in Arizona, but also across the United States. Before we get into questions with Harper, I'd like to just kind of explain why this topic is so important. I think you all kind of came because you have an understanding, but let's kind of just make the table set for a bit. So during the election last year, we saw a record number of anti-LGBTQ ads, specifically targeting trans people, painting them as menaces to society or a danger to society. And though trans women were particularly targeted in this attack, the rest of the community is not spared from this. Gay men and lesbian women are faced with accusations of being pedophiles for simply having a pride flag in their classrooms. Nonprofit organizations with a focus on the overall community have been targeted by the federal government. And public schools have lost incredible amounts of support from the government because they have LGBT focused social groups. And that isn't even everything. That's just a slice. What I've been telling a lot of people is like, I think when in November happened, we all kind of knew this was going to be an issue, but I don't think any of us kind of realized this was going to be such a central tentpole of the administration. So this is a bit of a wake-up call. So I bring this up to note that there's a lot happening right now in this space. And the questions we have laid out tonight are, like I said, kind of supposed to help you get a really good foundational understanding of how things are playing out and what you can expect in the future to kind of arm yourself with knowledge, and really go forward and um, you know do the best that you can and kind of hopefully leave with a bit of hope at the end of this conversation. So with that, I want to get started in the conversation with Harper Seldin, staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union in the LGBTQ and HIV project. Thank you so much for taking your time. I know that you're on the East Coast, so it's late for you, but I appreciate you taking your time and talking to us tonight.
No, thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be here with you and with you all and to be in conversation.
So let's talk a bit. Like, I want people to kind of understand who you are first. So let's talk a bit about your journey to where you are now, but also how you got here specifically. Like, what was the key moment in your life that made you choose civil rights litigation, and specifically this very niche topic of LGBTQ rights and HIV advocacy? Talk to us about how you got there.
Sure. No, I think there's a couple different ways to tell this story, but I'd say I went to law school intending to work in the public interest. I'd had an interest in child welfare issues, other social justice issues, especially around reproductive rights, and ended up clerking for 2 years. And in the process of that, realizing that, I really wanted a strong foundation in being a litigator before I pursued my life's work. And so I ended up at a large law firm where they had a very strong pro bono practice. And so I had a great time there. It was a commercial litigator sort of by day. And then the rest of my day, all my pro bono work was really focused on LGBTQ rights, specifically trans rights. This was a professional interest to me, but also personal interest. I'm transgender. I had transitioned in high school in the South in the early 2000s. And so for me, being able to then work on these issues as an attorney was enormously empowering. And so I had my law career. I became a partner at my law firm. And that was a real moment for me in March of 2022, where I decided, all right, I'm either going to spend the rest of my life as a partner at this law firm, which I loved, or, is there something else that I wanted to be doing? And I really had a moment where I'm not a particularly religious person, but I really felt called to do work on trans rights full time. Folks may remember in 2022, there were one or two states that had passed bans on gender affirming medical care for transgender adolescents in Arkansas and in Alabama. But we knew that there was a wave coming. And so I thought I need to be sort of on the front line of this. And so luckily at that time, the ACLU had an opening for a staff attorney position that really just worked out. But I specifically got into this work to defend the rights of transgender people, especially young people. And that's what I've been doing really for the last 2.5 years.
I'm gonna deviate away from the questions that we kind of talked about a bit, just kind of a follow-up there, because I think one of the things that people have been having a hard time with these days, especially within the community, is finding joy in the battle right now. So I wonder if maybe you can tell us a bit and kind of start this conversation with, what brings you the joy in doing this work that is right now very tumultuous and, very targeted against people within our community.
Yeah, no, I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I know other folks at the ACLU, we spend a lot of time thinking about this too. And I'd say the two things that really buoy me are the first are trans young people. As part of my job, I really have the privilege of talking to trans young people across the country and their families, and they are just extraordinarily resilient and brave, and they themselves are full of joy, right? Like I talk to them about being trans in states that have passed these bans, and we talk about that, but they tell me about how they love to play musical instruments, how they love to play sports, how they love to go camping with their families, and that they are just really committed to not only being themselves, but to really leading joyful, full lives. And so seeing that in the young people in our community gives me great joy. And the way that I sort of personally think about that is I think about my friends who were public defenders for many years, which is another sort of grueling job where you and your clients are just getting kicked in the face every day, for lack of a better term. And they talk about, wanting your clients to be able to live the life that you have and also making sure that you live a rich life like you want your clients to have. And so I really feel that with the trans young people that I'm able to serve in this role is that I too am like, you know what, I need to spend time with my husband. I need to go outside and touch some grass, right? Like the whole point of this work is so that people can lead rich and full lives. And so that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually kind of I feel that on the same level because before I even went into this work, I didn't care about kids at all. I don't have children. I never want children. I've kind of always said I will never be around children my entire life. And now I've kind of been surrounded by trans youth as we're doing this work, and they actually bring a very much a sort of verve to like the conversation. It's been very nice. Um, before we kind of get into the wonky legal conversation, because you are a lawyer and that's why you're here to talk about all this, what's happening, in the legal sphere. But before we kind of get into that, we're going to assume that a lot of people understand basic civics because just the way of our American education system. So let's go ahead and have a basic civic lesson on how the three branches of government work, who has power over what, the kind of power that the president is supposed to have, and then why this moment feels like an attack on those long established rules and norms of government. And I'm sorry, am I glitching out?
You're coming through. I'm okay.
Okay, perfect. My screen all crazy. And why this feels like an attack on those long established rules and norms of government. So I guess this question is a two-parter. So how is our system of government set up to be with checks and balances on each other, and where are those checks and balances today?
Sure. So yeah, I think at a moment like this, when everything feels very chaotic and uncertain, it's always good to start at the beginning, right? And so at the beginning of this conversation is really that we have three branches of government in our country. We have the executive branch, so think of the president and all of the agencies underneath them. We have the judicial branch, which is our court system with the Supreme Court at the top and then flowing all the way down to the district courts. And then we also have the legislative branch, and that's Congress. And so the way that this is supposed to work in the ordinary course is that Congress, our duly elected representatives in Washington, they're the ones who make the laws and pass the laws. That includes things like funding, right? Like decisions about, hey, we're going to spend a bunch of money to build roads in our country. That's Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. That becomes important when we see how some of these executive orders are set up to run. The executive branch, their job is to guarantee that the laws are duly executed. Basically, whatever Congress is passing, the executive is supposed to make sure it happens, right? If you think about people, he's saying, I'm making an executive decision or executive authority, that's the implementation. And then we have the judicial branch, which is supposed to say what the law is. So Congress passes a law, and then we have the judicial branch not only to resolve disputes, but also to say what the law is. That becomes important because of the way that executive orders then work. So an executive order is literally, in some ways, it's just a press release, right? It's the executive branch, meaning the president, saying to various agencies, I want you to write a report about, this environmental issue, or I want you to investigate this, or I want you to start interpreting a particular law in this way, or promulgate regulations about how to implement a new law that Congress has passed. And that's fine. That's every president does that. That's in the ordinary course. But there are limits to that, right? The president cannot use an executive order to overturn or change a law that Congress has passed, including funding. That is the executive branch. Also, the president can't use an executive order to tell the courts, this is how you have to interpret the law, because the court has an independent duty to do that. That becomes relevant because of the way that many of the executive orders, especially targeting trans people in the LGBT community, have been written. So, for example, there was one of the early executive orders was 14168, which sort of defined for the federal government sex in a way that really excluded trans people and intersex people, was sort of a reductive view separate from science. You know what? In some ways, the president has the authority to tell the agencies, like, this is how I want you to try to implement my policies. But the president then went further in later executive orders and wrote things like, I don't want, as a policy decision from the president, I don't think that young people should have access to gender-affirming medical care. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell hospitals and doctors, if you provide this care, we're going to revoke your federal funding. That's something the president can't do because Congress has already decided who's going to get what kinds of grants and where that money is going to go. And to the extent that some agency is making decisions about grants, it's the agency that does that. That was the point of the lawsuit PFLAG v. Trump, which was mentioned in my bio, is that we sued the Trump administration and the various agencies to say, hey, it actually exceeds your authority as the president to try to strip funding that Congress has already allocated. And the lower court in the District of Maryland agreed with us and said, that's exactly right. That's not something the president was allowed to do once Congress has made a decision. So I go through that sort of wonky explanation of how this works because the news that you see about these executive orders can be very misleading. It'll say president declares, no more care for transgender young people. That's not something the president has the power to do. And that's not exactly what the executive orders say either. And even what they say is not something the president can do. So I just think it's important to realize that, because what I talked about with a lawsuit, that's one check on executive authority, right? Is that private people can go to court and can sue, and a court can say, hey, president, hey, executive branch. That's not something that you're permitted to do. Congress, though, also has an important role, because Congress has the ability to push back and to say, hey, we passed that law, right? That's not something that the president can unilaterally do. So Congress has its own ability to also sort of police its own authority and say, we have the power of the purse. The executive branch can't write us out of the constitutional order. So it's in that way that push and pull among the branches, which I'd say in a healthy, functioning democracy is good, right? You get the checks and the balances so that you have representation, you have effectuation, and you also have mediation through the judicial branch. What we're seeing now is a lot of strain on the judicial branch because there's so much executive overreach that there's sort of an overwhelming number of cases going to the federal courts, which are doing an amazing job of keeping up, I think. And we're also seeing strain as we're not really hearing from Congress as much as we would like, as so much of these cases are about the president usurping their authority and making life worse for the citizens that they represent.
You mentioned the word strain, but I'm curious why you're using that word as like it's a strain on the courts, it's a strain on on Congress, because it would seem like more of an acquiescence to kind of what we're seeing from top down, because it doesn't sound like there is much pushback. These checks and balances aren't actively engaging against each other. There's kind of this essentially a buy-in on all three branches. So I guess I wonder, what is the strain, or is it just acquiescence?
I think I do think there could be much more pushback from everyone in this, right? I think that we are not seeing from Congress the kind of vindication of their own authority that we would anticipate. And so in that sense, yes, I do think we're unfortunately seeing acquiescence. I say strain, though, because I do think that the basic volumes serve as between the judicial branch and the executive branch, that is continuing, which is that the executive branch is doing something, private parties are coming to court to say, this is violating my rights, and the courts are quickly and overwhelmingly, I think, responding in ways that I think do vindicate the constitutional rights of certainly trans people and other people in our country. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying the courts are getting it right every time or getting it right fast enough to actually afford relief, but I do think that you are still seeing everyday judges doing their job and everyday people vindicating their own rights. I'd love to see more from Congress as a general matter to participate in this, but I do think the part of that I'm really focused on, which is the checks and balances that are afforded through the judicial branch, the executive branch, that is still functioning.
So you mentioned already, but there has been a litany of executive orders, and even I wonder if we can share this resource, but I follow Law 360, which has this amazing tracker of kind of where things are at. But it does seem like they're kind of coming at from multiple angles, and it's not just one. It's not one executive order. It's not two executive orders. It's a wave of executive orders. I wonder if for just the audience, for people who may not know the full breadth of these executive orders, can we kind of go through and kind of maybe just list off kind of what is out there right now? And it's not just removing the word transgender or queer from websites. It's not just trans women in sports. What exactly is being attacked right now?
Sure. So I think one of the easiest way to understand all of the executive orders that are out there that are targeting the LGBT community is to really talk about what are they trying to do. And I think top line, what these executive orders are trying to do is to erase trans people from civil life, right? That is the goal. It's to, in ways big and small, make it very difficult to be trans in public, certainly to be trans in the federal government as an employee, and then to essentially push trans people to the margins, and by doing so, make everyone's life smaller. And the way that I like to frame it is this: once the government can decide for you what is your sex really, and I think that that's part of the framing of these executive orders against trans people, right, is that trans people are really their sex assigned at birth and can't be anything else. Once the government is allowed to tell you whether or not you are a man or a woman and then prescribe what your life is supposed to look like, there's no natural end to that, right? Because then it's, well, what does it mean to be a woman? What kind of women? What should women be doing? What should men be doing? And I think we see that, for example, in one of the executive orders, which was one of the early ones, 14168, which basically directed the military, the Department of Defense, to expel transgender service members. That's being litigated on multiple fronts. That was a case that recently went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Just sort of, I'll take a little detour on that one. The transgender service members represented by not the ACLU, but other civil rights organizations sued, and they got in a lower court enjoined the Department of Defense from expelling transgender service members just because they were transgender. An intermediate appellate court said that's right. And while this case is proceeding, you cannot expel transgender service members just because they're trans. At the Supreme Court, however, they effectively stayed that injunction. So we're now anticipating that some service members will be involuntarily separated just because they are trans. And so, but if you look at what the original language of that executive order was, it basically said being transgender is incompatible with what we expect from our warriors, what we expect from people who are leading, an honest life of integrity. Like those are the words that the executive order uses. And so what that's essentially positioning trans people as inauthentic, as a threat to society, a threat to the American military order. And that view of the military is one that is extraordinarily masculine and focused on sort of this warrior ethos, which does not need to be gendered, but in sort of the Pete Hegseth era, that's what it's turning out to be. Again, I don't think that makes us safer. I don't think that is really doing justice to what members of our military are doing when they serve our country. But that's what these executive orders are trying to do. And they're doing it in multiple ways. The most obvious one is things like in the Department of Defense and our armed services, but it's also things like in military schools, removing books from the bookshelf that talk about the LGBTQ experience, or even broader sort of experience of being a member of a minority group. The other executive orders similarly use what I'll call sort of the threat of revoking federal funding to try to effectuate other goals. So we've seen that in the sports context, right? We've seen that in the context of trying to stop hospitals from providing care to transgender young people. That's come up a bunch of different ways in the Title IX and the education context. It's come up in the context of federal prisons. And really, so you think about all these different aspects of where trans people are and what we need to lead successful lives. The executive orders are targeted at either directly removing federal support for that or pressuring private parties to removing their support for that through the threat of revoking federal funding.
Now, I want to also, just on top of that, kind of understand why it's not just the executive orders, though. This is coming from different people within different parts of the executive branch, different department heads. I mean, so when we're seeing things like removing DEI from universities to make sure there's no federal money being used for that, or LGBTQ resources at universities, any kind of like Department of Education, or even the small things that you mentioned, like removing books from military universities like West Point. Are these department heads just following the executive orders, or is this also coming outside of the purview and people are also acting outside of that to effectuate this, this campaign?
It's a both and. I'd say a lot of the action that we're seeing from various agencies and departments it directly cites to the executive order that have been promulgated. And so, you'll get a letter from someone at DHS or DOJ or CMS that says, we've read Executive Order 14168. It defines sex in this way that excludes transgender people. So we're now going to change all of our manuals to say X. We're going to say that you can't address people using their pronouns. You have to use pronouns that correspond to their sex assigned at birth, right? We're going to separate restroom facilities on that basis. So you're seeing that implement. So in that way, yes, agencies are sort of directly implementing the executive orders. What I'll say, though, in terms of outside of that is that this, I think that the animus towards transgender people that we've seen didn't emerge fully formed from these executive orders, right? It existed. And so I do think that these executive orders are also giving cover to not just federal agencies, but I think really everyone in our country who already felt this way about trans people. These executive orders are giving folks cover to sort of do what they always wanted to do or say what they always wanted to say about trans people. And I know this because when I talk to trans young people in our country, like they read the news, right? They watch TV with their parents. And so I talked to a number of trans young people who said they went into school the next day and kids in their class who know they're trans went up to them and said, President Trump says you can't be trans anymore. And then they get misgendered. So like, that's not at all what the executive order said, but I do think that those school children have correctly tapped into what those orders are trying to do, which is to make public life and civic life impossible for trans people.
Now, want to also touch on the fact that what we're seeing right now is, though it feels very singular and very novel, it definitely is not unique to American history. We've talked about this in our conversation before, where we've seen these challenges before with McCarthyism, with the Lavender Scare, with Reagan and the AIDS crisis. But I think what feels different about now is that those kind of crises felt a bit top down and kind of sporadic, whereas this feels a bit more bottom up and kind of emboldening a larger swath of Americans to act in this way. Is this tactic, what we're seeing from the federal government, what we're seeing from the executive branch, is this tactic to squash dissent different compared to what we've seen in the past with civil rights movement in America, or is this very much in line with kind of what we've seen in the past?
I think that this is, reading from the same songbook. It might just be a very slightly different tune. And what I mean by that is, what we're seeing now is an attempt from the executive branch to arrogate power to itself. Both soft power in terms of what we were just talking about providing cover for folks who are not directly controlled by the federal government to sort of effectuate the social and political goals, but also hard power, which is what I think these executive orders are trying to do when they push Congress out from power of the purse, when they push back against the courts, trying to check their authority, right? So this mix of hard and soft power. And so I think that we've seen that before, right? That's not new. That's not something invented. I think the speed of this backlash has been particularly new. I think if you look at what anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation at the state levels have looked like, so not what Congress has been proposing, but what the 50 state legislators have been proposing. The ACLU tracker, I haven't checked it in a couple of weeks, but something like 3 years ago, it was like 500 bills. 2 years ago, it was the same number, but Texas wasn't in session. So if they had been in session, it would have been even bigger. This year, I think we might be in the 700 or 800s. Like it's just an enormous and accelerating number of bills that are also increasingly harsh and punitive, right? It's sort of accelerated from things like the bathroom ban in North Carolina, which was sort of an outrage. Corporate sponsors pulled funding out of events in North Carolina. Like that was, an enormous national conversation about a bathroom bill. And now bathroom bills basically get proposed every day across the country. And a number have passed in other states. And so we're just seeing the volume, I think, and the accelerated in terms of things like criminal bans, just like really trying to not just stigmatize trans people and LGBTQ people, but really criminalize the expression of those identities in public or in other settings. And so I do think that feels different to me just because of the way in which it was accelerating at the state level, and now really the federal government is picking up the baton and running even further with it, and also the way that it's affecting blue states as opposed to the last couple of years. There's been a lot of activity in red states, but blue states have largely been insulated from that by their state legislatures. But now what we're seeing is trans people who are in blue states realizing, oh my God, we have a state and a federal government, and now the federal government is directly hostile to my identity and my community. What does that mean? So I think that is also what has changed. Then again, we've also lived through periods in our history where that's been true, where there's some states have been more welcoming to minority communities and have had more formal legal protections, or at least more social protections, and other states don't. So that is not particularly new in America, but I do think the extraordinary difference between those two, visions of our country and the widening gap, that feels particularly accelerated at this moment.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to that, which is, it feels like right now we're kind of seeing in this moment, maybe even right before this election, what we were seeing is a bit of a patchwork of laws where if you were part of the community, you were safe in certain areas, and if you weren't, if you were in, an area, for example, Texas or Florida, you may have harsher experiences than somebody who lives in like California or Washington or New York or something like that, right? And so now you kind of mentioned the fact that we have this kind of federal overhang that kind of like digs down and affects these blue states. I wonder if there is a conversation to be had about what the Supreme Court how it might weigh in, because they have been very it seems very focused on giving states back their rights opposed to federal oversight. Is there anything like crystal balling of kind of what we might see, how the Supreme Court kind of views this federalism argument in this context?
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball on that one. I wish I did, but I do think that, this is the tension between, the heart of federalism, right? Is that everybody loves a 50-state laboratory until they realize that that changes the baseline for what kind of rights you have as an individual when you cross state lines. And to me, we've been in other moments in our country when we've had that, right? When you step across a state line and suddenly you are a part of the civil polity and suddenly you're not. We've had that also more recently when we think about marriage equality, right? This idea that you're married in this state but not in another. What kinds of reciprocal rights do you and do you not have? So we've had this conversation multiple times as a country with the Supreme Court. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to resolve the tension this time, but I do think we know as a country that it's largely untenable to have folks' legal status and the legal protections that they're entitled to change so dramatically just by virtue of crossing a state line, especially in a country where we so value the freedom to travel, and we're actually a really, in many senses, have more ability to change our geography than maybe in other points in history and certainly in other parts of the world. And I think that's important because, and I just want to sort of make this general conversation more concrete in terms of what I'm seeing in my work. I think about like the families with trans young people and their parents, and many of them who were living in Florida or living in Texas and saw what was happening. They may have decided to move to another state where they thought the state legislature was going to be more protective. So maybe they moved to someplace like Kansas or Indiana, and suddenly they find themselves also caught in the same trap of their children's medical care has now been outlawed in their state. There's a limited number of places they can go. But even then, even among those families, again, and the families who had the means to travel and the ability to sort of uproot their lives, which is by no stretch of the imagination the vast majority of families, but you think about even the families who were like the best positioned to say, this place isn't safe for my kid or my family, we're going to go. This place isn't safe for my family, we're going to go. So maybe they ended up someplace like California or New York or Illinois, and they thought, great, now we're in good shape. Then we have the inauguration, we have executive orders targeting trans people and medical care. And as one of the reasons that we brought suit so quickly in PFLAG v. Trump is because hospitals in California, in Illinois, and in New York stopped providing medical care to young people because they were worried about losing their federal funding. So you had all these parents who were like, I live in New York, I live in LA, I live in Chicago. What do you mean my hospital that's been telling me that they're going to protect me and provide care to my kid, like suddenly they don't serve my kind here, right? And so I think that was the new fear and realization that many trans people or certainly parents of trans people realized in this moment, was that suddenly like this federal overlay meant that if you were going to be within the United States, suddenly you were at the mercy of the federal government in determining whether you were going to be a full member of our civic polity or not. And so I think that is the kind of dramatic change in material circumstances that highlighted the difference between state level bans and federal attempts to restrict care that really is crystallized for a lot of folks. And again, this is a conversation that folks have been having in the reproductive healthcare space and the abortion context for many years. So this is not like a totally new area, but I do think that it's crystallized in this way for a lot of folks.
And last follow-up question on this. You mentioned, for example, people who live in New York, California, and the hospitals there that may have provided this care have stopped providing the care. And there is an argument right now about pre-compliance, and people online and people within LGBTQ advocate spaces saying stop pre-complying. I wonder if maybe you can explain kind of what's happening at the court level for people to kind of say, you don't need to follow this right now. If it mets out in the future, we'll face that then, but you don't need to right now. Is there any validity in these people's arguments, or how can you maybe kind of explain what people are saying, which is like, don't comply with these executive orders? Can they do that?
Yeah, and I think that's why I start at the beginning with like, what do executive orders do and what can they not do? Because this is what we mean in the context of like medical care for trans young people, what it means to not comply in advance. So what the executive order actually said was, the president said, I, President Trump, and directing these various federal agencies to write a bunch of reports and to look into or start the process of examining whether to remove federal funding from organizations that continue to provide gender-affirming medical care to people under 19. A lot of things had to happen before that was effectuated, right? You had agencies had to pick that up, they had to run with it. Because of the way that grants work, they had to notify hospitals, hey, you're now subject to this. There's like a whole administrative process that you go through to revoke grants in this way. At the end of the day, because a lot of that authority just wasn't within the executive branch to overturn Congress's will, even if the federal government said we're revoking your funding, it's like you just don't have the power to do that. That's just not something that you know, that's if President Trump stands up tomorrow and writes an executive order that says everyone has to hop on their left foot, like we don't all have to do that, right? But some people are going to decide that they're going to hop on their left foot because they are worried about the consequences of not complying. And so this was part of our PFLAC v. Trump lawsuit, is that in response to this executive order, hospitals were so afraid that they were going to lose their federal funding and so therefore lose their ability to serve anybody, that they stopped providing care. And so that's when we went to court and we said, there's a lot of things wrong with this executive order, but in addition to the fact that the executive branch doesn't have the authority to do this, they're already getting what they want, though, because they are coercing third parties to comply, even if they don't have the power to do so. And so one of the things that Judge Herson from the District of Maryland wrote in his opinion is he said, yes, not only does the federal government not have the authority to revoke this funding, but that's exactly what they're trying to do, is to use the threat of that improper threat to get hospitals to do what they want. And in fact, a couple weeks after that executive order was issued, the White House issued a press statement that said, I see all these hospitals have stopped providing care. This is working as intended. They literally said like that was our goal, was to intimidate hospitals into providing care. There were many hospitals, though, that even in the face of that executive order said, you know, we've not been told not to provide care. There's nothing in this order that changes our ability to provide care, so we're going to continue to provide care. And so that, though, there were plenty of hospitals that did that and they've not suffered legal consequences. So that's what we mean by not complying in advance, is that sort of having the reliable sources of information to understand what executive orders do and don't do, so that folks can, again, make their own decisions about what they're going to do, but understand whether is this a proper threat, an improper threat, or something that's just so completely outside of the executive branch's authority that it's like being told you all have to hop on your left foot, and none of us have to do that.
You know, and this will lead into our conversation, our next couple questions about the Supreme Court. But one of the things that you're mentioning here is this kind of understanding of I'm sorry, my dog is so loud drinking water. This kind of understanding that the framers of the Constitution wanted a weak executive, and that's why we have these kind of balances. But I think one of the conversations that the administration is having, and very much kind of arguing in court, is this argument of a unitary president. I'm wondering if maybe you can or a unitary executive branch, and kind of the power that is vested within the executive branch. I wonder if maybe you can kind of explain a bit what the federal government is arguing in these cases. They do have that power.
Sure. So I will say that even within the executive branch, the rules of how the executive branch works are not the president does what he wants. Like that's not the rule. And that is not too dissimilar from what the theory of the unitary executive is, right? It's that the president does what he wants. The executive branch, all the agencies and personnel in it serve at the president's pleasure. They're there to do his bidding. That's not really how it works, right? Like we have a whole set of administrative systems and checks and balances, even within the executive branch. We have, protections for federal employees who are not political appointees, but are sort of rank and file civil servants. We have rules about how regulations work, right? How the notice and comment rules about if the EPA wants to issue a new regulation. How do they do that? How do then citizens have an opportunity to participate in that process? What does, and what does that look like? And so the infrastructure of how our government works takes place in what we call sort of administrative law. It's like how do the dictates of Congress about, like, we're going to pass a rule about how coal plants have to regulate what they their emissions. Like, how does that actually result in clean air? Basically, that happens through the administrative branch. And the unitary executive theory tries to collapse that into one, which is just what the president wants. So that's why a lot of the lawsuits that we're seeing are things like the president says, I'm going to fire all these people who are running this agency in a way that I don't want. And that's just not an authority that the president has, right? There are rules about under what circumstances the president can remove certain political appointees, but not civil servants, right? And that's just sort of part of what makes our country run so well, and why we have a functioning civil society where our food is safe and our air is clean, and sort of we're able to sort of go about our lives. And so I think that what we're seeing now is an attempt not only to consolidate power within the executive branch, right, to have this unitary executive that really is at the president's pleasure, but also trying to force the judicial and the legislative branch to go along with that as well. So we're seeing sort of a microcosm within the executive branch of what we're seeing on a macro level across the three branches.
Got it. So, going deep and diving a bit into Supreme Court. So, as we mentioned, we talked about the Supreme Court is this other check you work within this judicial branch, executive, kind of like looking at this check on the other two. I'm curious, how they have acted on civil rights in the past and how they're acting different now, if they are acting different now. At the start of the 21st century, we saw a bit of movement towards in terms of same-sex marriage, in terms of tax benefits, religious discrimination kind of peeled back a bit in some cases. Now that doesn't seem to be the case, especially with the makeup of this court. We're kind of seeing, I like to say, it's a pendulum swing in the other direction toward the benefit of religious groups, which kind of is fueling a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the conversation around this. And they're getting significant carve-outs. So how is the Supreme Court reading case precedent differently? Because I think one of the things that for anybody who is listening to the Supreme Court cases, they're going, I thought this was established. I thought this was well known, but they're kind of reversing precedent, or they're reading precedent differently. So how are they reading precedent now, and kind of what does that mean for the future of LGBTQ issues that will be coming from the Supreme Court, especially healthcare access and other civil rights for queer people?
Yeah, I think the at the heart of sort of these conversations about civil rights and civil liberties and the role of the Supreme Court is basically, how do we live in this big country together when we're all so different and have very different views about how we want to live our own lives, and the kind of communities that we want to live in. And I think that the baseline of the Equal Protection Clause in our Constitution and various anti-discrimination laws in our country is we said, okay, there's at least a couple things where we don't think it's fair to treat people differently or to afford them different opportunities or privileges based on things about them, things like race, things like sex, things like religion. What we're seeing now is an increasingly muscular attempt to carve exceptions out by the Supreme Court for folks who want to treat people differently because of their religious beliefs. And this sort of gets at a heart of some of the tension in the First Amendment, which has a lot of different components, but part of that is, basically free exercise in the Establishment Clause, which is, sort of not my usual part of the amendments, but I'll do my best. And so free exercise is basically this idea that, like, you get to believe what you want to believe, right? You get to practice whatever religion you want, or no religion at all, and the government doesn't have a role in that. The Establishment Clause is more about there shouldn't be a state religion, right? And the state should endorse a religion. And I remember one of my law professors said, the real tension there is, are we protecting the churches from the state, or are we protecting the state from the churches?
It's almost like freedom from religion or freedom for religion.
Right. And so there's a tension there, like there's a legal writer, Ali Mistel, who talks about, we have a First Amendment not because we love speech, but because we love censorship. And so we have a First Amendment to protect us from our impulses to censor. And so I think that that's part of the tension. I think what I am worried about is that we have seen in places like Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, Masterpiece Cake Shop, this idea that there's something different about LGBTQ people, and there's something different about how certain religions think about LGBTQ people. And so the normal rules of we don't treat people differently because of who they are, maybe that doesn't apply in some contexts. Not just in terms of what you believe or how your religious place of worship functions, but in things like your ability to participate in society, like going and buying a cake, or who you are. And my concern is not only that increasing religious exemptions will make it harder for LGBTQ people to participate in civil society and to be ourselves, but that there's no logical end to that. Because if you can get a religious exemption for treating LGBTQ people a certain way, why is there a limit there? Why shouldn't you be able to treat women differently because your religion has certain beliefs about women or people of a different race than you? So I think that in terms of and again, it's not like there was some perfect time in the past where we had all this solved and now it's been devolving. This has been an ongoing conversation in our country about what kind of civil polity we have, how do we exist in a country with all these different views and all these different people. I think, though, that in terms of the pendulum swing, giving too much of a veto to one group or any group about what that's going to look like, that is where it gets tricky and it gets harder to hold the civil polity together. And so in terms of what the future looks like for LGBTQ rights, we have the Scrimetti case up before the Supreme Court now. And I think that that's going to be, one early place where we see, what direction is the Supreme Court going? Because at the heart of that case is really this issue of, when the government draws lines based on sex, how closely do courts scrutinize that? And that in that case, it's applied to trans people, but there's no reason that rule, if it changes, isn't going to affect sex discrimination law broadly. And that would be an enormous sea change if suddenly the pretty close look that courts give to laws that treat men and women differently or people differently based on their sex, if that weakens at all, I think that's going to disrupt a lot of what we take for granted in terms of protections against sex discrimination in our country. So this is my concern, right? It's not just the erosion of rights for LGBTQ people, but the erosion of civil rights for people more broadly once we get to a point where suddenly the government is prescribing how people should act.
I wonder if the Montgomery case is also a bit of a reflection on, maybe not a reflection, but also a bit of a canary in the coal mine with how much power we give to individuals in deciding what can and can't be talked about or, being shown to children in general. Because from my understanding, the Montgomery case is very much, parents want to be able to decide what their children should or should not be seeing in schools. And it's related to an LGBT book being taught to youth. But if the Supreme Court sides in one way, the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it really would give deference to parents to make wide decisions on what students can learn. So it seems like not only the Scrimetti case, but also the Montgomery case really opens up floodgates for how people can decide how to treat others. Am I fair in understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and I think so for folks who may not be aware of this case, there's a case before the Supreme Court that has to do with Montgomery County Schools, I believe, out of Maryland, and whether parents can opt out their children from lessons that include storybooks that touch on things like, families that have same-sex parents, people who are trans or gay, right? Books that have LGBTQ characters or themes. Again, with these complex issues, I always think it's good to sort of start from the beginning. In our country, we have public schools. It's an amazing strength of our country. Public schools are supposed to be for everyone in the community. And so, but as a parent, you don't have to send your kids to public school. State may require that you educate them in some way, but you don't have to send them to public school. You can homeschool them. You can send them to a religious school. You have the ability as a parent in deciding the upbringing of your kids. Once you decide to send your kid to public school, though, you're buying into the public part, right? Where this is school for everyone. And so you get to decide whether or not you send your kids to public school, but you don't get to veto what happens during the school day because you don't like it. And this has been a longstanding set of rules and tensions in our country, which is how do public schools work? So we've had that conversation many times. And I would say, the consensus on the law has been, as a parent, you don't get to veto what happens in the school day. What we're starting to see now, using especially trans issues, but LGBTQ issues more broadly, is parents essentially trying to veto what is happening, what everyone's kids are learning because of what they do or don't want their kids to learn. And to me, that is again sort of eroding, the glue that keeps public schools and really civic life together. And so that case is not really about what kids should or should not be taught by their parents about LGBTQ people. It's about who are public schools for, and what are public schools for. And so I think that kind of framing in my mind makes it easier for people to say, well, yeah, I have my own views about what I want to teach my kids about LGBTQ people, but public schools are for everyone, so I'm going to do that at home. And when they go to public school, they go to public school. And so I think that is sometimes what's lost in these conversations. And so my hope is that the Supreme Court starts the conversation from that place of public schools are for everyone, and not from a place of somewhere else, because I think we might not get a result that I'm as enthusiastic about for our constitutional order. But again, we'll have to see how that gets framed out.
So last question, and then maybe we'll have a few time for a few questions from the audience if there are any. So people want to feel involved. They want to get activated. One of the big things that we hear at Lookout is people feel inundated with so much going on, and that it's a bit of analysis paralysis mixed with like the shock and awe that comes from this campaign from the federal government as well as state governments. And so I know that this is something important to you. So what are the ways that people can get involved in moving towards change? And more specifically, is there a world in the future where we can course correct what is going on? Or is this really a long haul moment in our history?
I think it's a both and. I think
What a lawyer answer.
right.
The yes and lawyer answers.
Yes, and it depends. These are my favorite weasel words. But I do think it's true here, and in this way. I think that we are in for the long haul, right? I think that this is going to be a long moment in American history about what kind of country we want to be and what kind of country we want to create together. But we do that every day. Right, sort of how you live, how you spend your days is how you spend your life is a sort of a motto that I have for myself, and I think it's also not a terrible organizing principle in general, right? If the kind of country that you want to have 10 years from now is the kind of country that you work a little bit towards every day, but that feels like a really big problem, and so to break it down into smaller chunks, I would encourage everyone to find the thing that you are passionate about. Like for me, trans rights is my thing. That is what I'm doing. That is now my life's work. Like I'm all in on this. There are other things that I care about. This is the thing that I'm all in on. Whatever it is for you, pick the thing. I would encourage you to pick one or maybe two things, but not more than that, because there's so much to do. And then maybe pick what level you want to work on. For me, I'm focused on a national litigation practice. So I'm looking at trans rights across the country. For you, maybe it's your issue and it's your city, it's your state, maybe it's national or international, but whatever geography makes sense. And then find the people who are already doing that work. Whatever it is you care about, there's probably someone who's already like, you know what, I really care about libraries in our city, right? Or I really care about racial justice in our state, right? Like there's someone who's doing that. Find those people and then organize with them. This is the thing that I love about community organizing, is that it is something that we do together. It is something that we can take turns doing, right? People can step up and step back in it. And it's not something that, because of the First Amendment, it's not something the government can stop you from doing. And so I love it even more, right? And so I think that sort of embracing that American value of working together as a community, that's how we meet this moment, is by supporting each other, by finding folks who are like-minded, by then finding folks who we can hopefully persuade to see things our way and to work towards us, at least towards common values, even if we have different ways of getting there. And I think that is sort of that incremental, that is where you get that incremental change, right? It's in community. I think it's also like, this is a very isolating moment. And I think honestly, when I speak to audiences that are mostly trans or non-binary people, I talk about like the other goal of the federal government right now is to make trans people's lives smaller, right? So that we feel like we can't participate in society, so that we isolate ourselves, so that we are not in community. So the way that you resist that is that you are in community, right? You refuse to make your life smaller, to be afraid. And the way that you do that is in community, because to be one person standing against the federal government is unbearable. To do it as a community, that is a source of, I think, strength and also joy. And that's true for the trans and non-binary community. I think that's true for every community in this moment that feels like the federal government is not working towards, or the state government is not working towards the kind of country you want. In community, like the government, it doesn't exist apart from us, right? Its authority comes from us. So I think speaking in that one voice as a community, that's how we meet this moment. And again, the subject area of what you care about, I think, there's a lot of issues out there, but I think picking one and finding a community where you can do that work is going to be the path forward.
I'm going to take one question from the audience and we're going to close up. So this is a question I feel like a lot of people might have, and so I think it's fair to kind of pose it to you, as posed to both of us, but I'll pose it to you since we only have time for one answer. And the question is really, what recommendations do you have to productively engage with individuals who have very strong opinions about trans people participating in sports or the military or youth accessing gender affirming care. I think of, for example, I have family who are very much against the idea of trans women in sports. And I know for me, it's important to sit down and interrogate the reason why they think that in a loving and open way without attacks. So at least I can understand kind of like where their level of misinformation is coming from. But what are ways that you what tools do you have to productively engage with people who are very much on the other side of this, but may be curious to kind of be learning more?
I think the two things that I have found effective have been exactly what you suggest, which is asking questions, not leading questions, but sort of open, curious questions about not just why do you think that, but what is it you're worried about, right? I think that at the heart of this anti-trans feeling is some kind of worry or insecurity. And so like finding what that is and then meeting people where they're at. I also think that people find it very easy to be hostile or hateful towards people they've never met, or to people who feel far away on the news. And so I think to the extent that you are able to share from your own personal experience, your own personal story, like what it actually means to be trans and what that's like, I can't tell you the number of people I've met who've said, and until I had a kid who was trans, or a grandkid who was trans, or a neighbor who was trans, like I didn't know from this, and now suddenly I have a different worldview on this issue because I have the personal experience. And so I think that those are the two main paths. I also think, when that conversation sort of stalls out, the other way that I think we can frame this is sort of like, what kind of world do you want to live in? And so I use this especially when I'm talking about how trans rights are really an issue for everybody, which is, do you want to live in a world where the government tells you, I see that you're a woman and this is how you need to live your life because you are a woman? Or I see that you are a man and this is how you need to live your life because you're a man. Do you want to live in that world? And I think most people have a point at which they're like, I don't want to live in that world. Or they're like, well, it depends on what the government says. And I'm like, all right, either of those answers suggest that what you don't actually want is the government telling you how to structure your life. And so I think that that's true for trans people. That's true for LGBTQ people. That's true in a lot of different ways. And so I find, that framing is not the best place to start a conversation, but sometimes when I want to end the conversation, I go to what kind of world do you want to live in? Because I do think that that is also an opportunity for people to express their values. Right. And so, and if you have shared values, I think you can make progress. If you don't have shared values, I think that's a lot tougher. I would posit that actually you can always find shared values on some level of abstraction. So maybe you need to start there. We all care about young people, whatever it is. But I think those are the different ways that you can sort of at least leave room open for conversation for people to meet you where you want to be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Harper. Harper Seldin, staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union and the LGBTQ and HIV project. Super appreciate you taking the time, and I'll pass it back to Kathy.
Oh, thank you both so much. And Harper, I love particularly, I don't think that I could possibly improve on the way you framed how to get engaged at the community level, because that is what we do. That is what civic engagement beyond voting does. And if these are issues that you are concerned about, and they are not just happening at the federal level, they are happening at your school board, they are happening at your city council. Heaven knows they are happening at the Arizona State Legislature. So there are so many different ways close to home that you can stand up for the rights of other people and speak up in supportive ways. So I want to thank you both. This has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. I have to go back and listen to it again. As a matter of fact, it was a lot of substance here. So Harper, again, thank you so, so much. And Joseph, thank you for being a great interviewer. This was a terrific discussion. So thank you all for joining us. And as Sundrop has said, we'll be distributing the recording to everybody who signed up, and also we'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel. So thank you all so much, and good evening.